Is that not? Okay, that's better. All right, I apologize. I stopped coding for a while, so I'm no longer like technically savvy anymore. So first, the public service announcement. So later today, the people in the Jenkins community are meeting at the H3242. So if you're interested in meeting the rest of the community, be there, and then we have fun. So today I kind of wanted to talk about, I guess, a bit of my experience of going from an open source hacker to sort of company around this effort, in the hope that it will kind of help those of you who are thinking about the similar journey at some point. So I'm a hacker. I created this project called Hudson. That was the continuous integration server while I was working at this company called Sun Microsystems, which some of you might already know, which is kind of a little bit sad. And this project became Jenkins. And then at around the same time, I left Oracle. It didn't take long for me to discover that Oracle is not my company, which speaks more about myself, not about Oracle. Just so you know. And then I started this company to build a business around the Jenkins project. And then it kind of really quickly joined hands together with the CloudBees, and then now I'm working as the CTO of CloudBees. So Jenkins, it's at this point, it's this, right now it's probably the best described as the open source automation server. So people use it to do all kinds of software development automation work, to batch processing, to even monitoring nanny cam, which is like one of the most exotic use cases that I've heard about it. And then it has the 250,000 installations that we track around the world. And then they are collectively driving almost close to 1 million computers to drive a lot of, again, these workloads. So I'm kind of responsible in a small way for the climate change, because all these computers are generating heat, right? That's not great. But everything else is great. So we estimate the users in the order of millions. So this is this became a pretty big project. And so CloudBees, it's a company, I guess, behind Jenkins is a bit of a difficult statement, and I'm going to get to that a little later. But it has we have a lot of expertise around DevOps and Jenkins, and we help people sort of drive this continuous delivery project or the DevOps initiatives at the enterprise. And we have this, the product, the support, some of which I'm going to talk more about the details. And then last but certainly not least, by doing all these activities, we can hire people who work on the Jenkins project to push the effort forward. And in this context, that's the part of it that really makes me proud. So the reason this talk is called Hackers Gotta Eat is, we gotta earn some bread on the table, right? I mean, especially after the sun went down the tube, it really left a strong impression on me that having a good technology is not enough. You have to, in order to make a big enough impact to the world, you have to create the sustainable model. And when you can bring the money to the table, that opens up a lot of possibility of how to sustain the project. So, that basically comes down to making money. So I don't feel about that as a shame as at one point I used to be. So I wanted to talk about some of the different models that the people have pursued, and we have also pursued. So the first one I'm going to mention is professional services. So the idea here is, so you or some number of the contributors that you hire as employees, you go out and then you provide your services. So you show up in person, maybe consult on something, write some code together, help them fix problems, whatever, and then you charge for the money. So, so this was really great in the early on. So this was the very first thing I took on with another guy. And then, by then, the product was kind of reasonably well known, right? So people already knew who I was, and then it wasn't very difficult to land a few gigs like that. And then I also gained this very up-close experience about how people use our software in the real world. Now, in my case, I was the user of my own software long before I just turned into the full-time gig. So I knew where I knew something about how this was used, but it was always interesting to see the wholly different environment, an entirely different company using my own software. And then that gives you a lot of thoughts about what needed to be done. So more than money, it was helpful in like getting the direction of the project in the right way. So, and then this consulting work, it doesn't really require any huge upfront investment. You basically just need to jump up and down and say, hey, like I'm ready to take your money, and then some people will basically show up. It's that easy, especially in audio. Now, when you get bigger, like things would obviously change. But the next one I kind of wanted to talk about is training. So, this should be also pretty obvious, right? So the key idea is, you teach people how to use your software or how to run them. And it does require some upfront investment, as in, like in order to do a training, you have to create some materials, labs, you have to figure out some logistics, like how to get the venue, and some level of marketing is necessary and all that. But still, this was, in the grand scheme of things, pretty easy thing to get started, right? You already know a lot about the software you produce. And it's surprisingly more crappy than you think it is. So people need a lot of information about how to use it effectively. So that was, in fact, for me, like one of the key benefits of doing this was, as you are writing the training materials, you get to see how your software is coming across to users. And you feel like, oh, this is not great. Like I got to fix the software so that I can write this part of the training materials a little better. And that feedback loop was kind of really useful. And once you hit the crash screen, like it repeats, the process repeats again, right? So you have a lab, and then like you watch people struggle behind your shoulders, and you get a lot of insight about, oh, this is how they get stuck, right? And like the system produces some weird error messages, and like people are like really struggling how to get forward, and you get a very insightful view into different use cases in much more scalable way than the professional services. So that was really great. My training also, can produce a fairly significant revenue for the amount of time you need to put in. So that you show up for the one-day training, you have 10 people, say, charging for $2K each, so that's already $20K. Now, you can't do that 365 days a year. Like, there won't be enough people who want to be trained like that. But still, if you're trying to combine this, let's say, save some time to build the product, then this is kind of like a nice combination. So early on, like I did the training myself, and then enough to the point of like at some point my brain would switch to this automatic mode, and I can just talk about whatever in this next chapter without even thinking about it. And then so that part of like a repetition start to kind of made myself a little less motivated over the period of time. But early on, it really was great. And also, you get a lot of conversation going with the people coming. And that's almost like half the value they are getting is not just the training manuals, but the fact that they can engage with all sorts of the conversation. And they describe the challenges they have. And then again, those things really help you calibrate what problems in the space that your software could solve. And then that leads to another common thing that you can do, which is the enterprise product. So the challenge is the training and professional services, fundamentally it does not scale, right? Every time you deliver something, you gotta put in some work. The product is the sort of first more scalable thing. So you can build something once and then sell multiple times. But so it's kind of like obvious destination that we all head to at some point. But I also discovered that this is a very interesting challenges work. So open source, I was more used to the idea of, well, let's just put the code out there, and then people who know what they're doing is going to look at that and they grok the idea, and then they start using it, right? That's kind of like how the good open source software spread, which is like a words to words, words of mouth between developers in occasions like this. Now, enterprise software does not sell for itself, especially when you have a competitor called the open source project that's just as great and it's completely free, right? So you need this like a salespeople, and that's a different beast. And you also as an open source guy, like that's something like I had like a zero experience on. So in my case, it was like I was very lucky to kind of join hands with the forces like Cloudbees, where like they, but even back then, we like Cloudbees built a small enterprise sales arm, and then over the period, so that was 2011, and now it's 8 years forward. You really see, like I really saw how the sales org has grown, not just in size, but how they approach the problem of selling. And that's been kind of fascinating. And it really made me appreciate about, oh, this is an art of its own. And it's better to bring the right people. But anyway, the point is that you need these folks. And then also, in order to sell a credible product, you kind of need some critical mass of features and stories. And that's sort of really early on, it was difficult. So very first features that I implemented that eventually kind of became the foundation of the enterprise product, I did it through the professional services. So I was able to find this arrangement where somebody wanted their problem to be solved, but they were willing to let me keep the IP. So I could keep the code and I can sell it elsewhere, basically. That was the idea. So I didn't do professional services myself long enough to see if that's a common setup or not, but I'm still very grateful that that person who kind of let me solve this first bootstrap problem. Now, if you can raise the money and so on, that's less of a problem and so on. So there are other ways to work around that kind of things. But I really enjoyed that, being able to build something, knowing that this already solves somebody's problem, because often that's kind of hard thing. Like you feel like, and some people must need these features, but you never really actually know that. And in the open source project, you have a ways of validating and course correcting throughout the development, but proprietary product is not like that. If you're selling it, they expect the software to meet certain quality from day one. That means like the point in which you can discover when the feature is crap is actually pretty late in the game. Then as the effort kind of gets bigger, the next sort of challenge was how to drive a defensible, clear line between what happens in the open source and what happens in the product. In part because your open source project is like a thriving and happy. There are contributors implementing feature left and right. So if you end up picking the proprietary space that's too close to the open source, then what's going to happen is the community people think, oh, that's a great idea, let's implement this. And then suddenly some of the features material in the open source. Or in other cases, there are certain things only you can do, but again, if that's too close to the software that's in open source, it can come across as you're sort of like sucking the oxygen out of the open source project by intentionally not letting that go into this space because you're trying to keep it in the enterprise product. And that could create like a trust problem, or in the worst case, it could prevent the software from base open source software from getting improved sufficiently, and then you lose against the competition in the open source space. So there's these challenges like that. The other thing we kind of got early on that I didn't appreciate the importance was instead of charging it once, you gotta really nowadays you gotta really charge for the subscription, meaning every recurring money per year. And then that sort of changes. It's not just about how you charge the money, but it really creates the entirely separate motivations and emotion around sales and how do you make your customers happy, how do you license, how do you price them, etc. So I think nowadays it's more and more common. People are used to that idea thanks to companies like Adobe pushing that. But early on, this was still pretty high friction thing. And last but not, actually, then the next one that I wanted to talk about is support, like a software as a service. This also is pretty obvious one, right? Like you produce a software, it's great. So you help people run it by taking on that responsibility on you. It's a very easy to understand model. And there's also inherent economy of scale, especially if you start hosting lots of people. So that's how you kind of create the margin to make money. Now, but this is also kind of like a tricky. There's always people, especially early adopter of open source projects. They have people who can control more of their time, but they don't really always have the control of the money. So the trade-off that's going on in their head is, well, I can run this service on my own, or I got to ask my boss to cough up X amount of money. And that often, they don't make the right trade-off, like a right judgment call for the organization. So you have to kind of always fight against that, and then that also creates this upper bound in how much you can charge. It also, in case of the software Jenkins, right, this is fundamentally more customizable for individual user. So the scale of economy of scale in our case was really hard to achieve. Now some other projects are not like that, so then they are good. But there's always this tug of war between needing to customize against individual users versus trying to run the uniform things as widely as possible for the better economy of scale. And then nowadays, obviously, the problem with this is that if you're really successful, then Amazon will come over, hey, you got a nice cake over there, let me have it. Now, in some sense, it's like it's a sign of success. So I don't necessarily mean it as a problem, and it only shows up at the ferry down the road. So you have enough time to build some other, the competitive advantage and so on. But I guess in this current climate, I felt like I got to mention that. So next one, I think the last one I wanted to cover is support. So I think, again, this is also a very obvious concept. You're providing not the software as a service, but the expertise as a service. So these things are really helpful for the larger organizations in ways that I originally didn't understand. But it also kind of naturally complements this typical shortcomings of open source project, which is, again, you have a bit, but most often, you don't do enough job on explaining how to use that software, or how best that should be used, or how to enable lots of people to effectively use that project. So support, it kind of nicely complements them. And as a result, what it does is it really drives the adoption of the software at a larger scale in the bigger organizations. So open source projects, again, tend to be adapted in a bottom-up manner. So, right, so if you imagine if you're like a 5,000 developer company, like, well, I don't know, let's say IBM, well, then 50,000 companies, right? Then it's usually the open source project happens in ways where one guy in the team just decides to install that on their computer, or run it on their EC2 account, and then that's it. So it's sort of like an isolated effort at different pockets of the world, which is kind of not very nice for the larger organization. So what they are often trying to do is, well, let's figure out how to make this the really widely applicable for the entire organizations, and that needs the second line help, that needs training, certification, and those are the kind of things that actually pretty lucrative for commercial business around open source in ways that really help the open source project. So, so the support was useful, but this is often also kind of a hardest one to launch, right? So you need when I was just doing this with me and another buddy, I can't really claim we have a credible support. I didn't want to be waken up by 4 a.m. because somebody in India was having a problem. So it took the larger organization, people around the world, and some processes and all that stuff to do it. So it's an art of its own again. And then you have to also hire the people with the right expertise or figure out a way to train them. All right, so that's kind of a different business models and some of the, actually, if I move on, at Cloudbees, we did all that, right? And then all of these things kind of help each other, or your emphasis shift from one to the other as the company or the project gets bigger. So I think you'll find some of these combinations, perhaps in different combinations, useful for you, but these are the key ingredients. So another thing I kind of learned a lot about this interaction between the open source project and the company is around people, right? Because we are in the community dev room, so we understand the importance of the people who push the project forward. It's the same with the company. And then when you try to build a company around open source project, what often you do is to hire people from the project, right? That's where you know the good qualified people. And you already know, you don't need to train them because they already know your code base. They already share your mission. So a lot of what needs to be filtered out is already happening. So that's super convenient. Now, the second point, and then people, you already know how to work with people, which is actually true and false in some fascinating way, but I don't have enough time to talk about that today, unfortunately. So, and then employing these people because they already believe in the a passion and the mission of the project. What that enables you is they can sort of translate that passion into make a bigger impact. These people say, sometimes we hire people who are only working in the project as a weekend spare time thing, right? So, and then when you can sort of help them, uplift them from that spot to be able to work on the project full time, they can do 5 times, 10x more impact. So that's really valuable. And then the other nice thing that I saw happen is these are often a local Jenkins champion in the company, and when we bring them over, their boss is oh, now crap, okay, the guy who's been running Jenkins for me is gone. I guess I need to buy the support. So not only I get the employee, but he brings the sales lead. It's a great, it's double whammy. Now, that said, the hiring people from the project, that's come with the challenges. So sometimes, because they're so passionate about the project, there is a boundary between how much is the company's work and then how much is they're working on some things that the company doesn't really care about, but they personally care about. It could become, that somebody has to think that can get really painful. And or the other people in the company, it becomes really unclear, okay, so this guy is, employee of a company is working on this project, so I'm going to ask for them to do more. But it turns out that the guy is actually not working on it as a day job. It's just his weekend passion plugin or something. And then, so that created some friction like that. And then it's also not really healthy if you start to occupy, say, a more and more contributor base into the single company. So suddenly, what felt like a level playing field is now suddenly lopsided into one big guy and then lots of small folks, and that creates a tension in the project. And every time you put out somebody, this is kind of a cruel way to say it, but when they are working outside the company, we were not paying them anything, and they are still contributing to the project. We brought them on board, now we are paying them, and then so we kind of lose out in a sense that they're sort of getting a free labor, right? That they're sponsored by other parts of the world. So that's also not quite healthy. So over time, it's kind of, let's see. So yes, so over time what happens is, let me just move on here. So then the fact that when this company gets a little bigger sort of creates more a certain dynamism around how to interact with the project. So we wanted to create more a smoother boundaries between the people who know how to interface with the project and the rest of the company who may or may not have the open source background, which is the kind of thing that happens when a company gets bigger. And it also try to be more on the same page. It's kind of embarrassing if I kind of go out in the community and hey, we think we should do this, and another employee from the company says, oh, that's a horrible idea. Then sort of we both of us kind of lose the credibility. So having some opportunity to discuss what we are trying to drive in the community, get the feedback, or have some conversations to adjust the course so that everyone is happy. That's sort of being a part of the valuable cycle. And now when things get bigger, the other things change. So for example, the open source DNA, originally when I was hiring everyone from the same community, we kind of naturally bring people who feel and think the same way. But as the company gets bigger, obviously you start hiring other job functions, people from outside the community, and that will morph your sort of, you can't really take the open source DNA for granted. And then it doesn't mean, or the even worse cases, there are other people who does other open source projects in different ways, and then you feel like they have open source DNA, but you and them mean different things. So it requires more conscious care and maintenance. On the other hand, anytime you have this project or any community, it develops a certain kind of groupthink because it's a self-filtering process, right? And then the fact that the people think the same way makes them blind to certain kind of risk or the opportunity, etc. And then like, when we talk about the importance of diversity in the community, that's what we really trying to address, right? We want to make sure that the people are looking at the different things and feel the different ways so that the important ideas or like a signals doesn't get lost. So this was in some sense really rewarding by having people from different backgrounds, people from outside, people who do different languages, designers, people writing technical documentation. Everyone brought in this new perspective. And also as the company kind of gets bigger, the internal contributors needs to be treated more like external contributors, like because you can't really assume, like you can't really command, right? So the thing when you're working with open source projects, you can't command them to do something. You have to think about their incentives, how to encourage them to do more, how to help them feel successful. And all of that is very much true, even if you're working for the same company. And that's become more pronounced when it gets bigger. So I spend too much time talking about stuff, so I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff. So all of this, like, you might be feeling, wow, it's kind of complicated. And it is complicated and it's really painful. It's also like a worrisome at time. Right? So why, like, is it worth, why bother? Like, why is it worth doing? So I think, well, it's kind of like speaking to the core. I mean, you're already in this mindset, I'm sure. But I sort of fundamentally believe that the open source is eating the world. Like, it is the way, like, I think we have proven to the world that this is the better way to develop software. And then so more and more organizations, I think, are getting the idea that this is how you need to like, develop the software. So in order to solve bigger and better problems in open source, because today we mostly rely on people's goodwill, their spare time, their employee, or their boss being like a very friendly, in order to push the project forward, right? But that really only can take you so much. So by building this commercial activity around, by using that money to fund the development, and then, for example, one thing it allows us to do is to bring a different skill sets to the table. So Jenkins project traditionally had a lot of Java developers, but we didn't really have any design people, and that showed in the software. So one of the things that the club was able to do, thank you. So those of you, oh, this hurt more than I thought, but so what was I saying? Yeah, so the company was able to hire the designer to work in the project, which did not naturally happen, again, partly because of the groupthink and all that things. So that was one great project. Similar thing about the technical writer, etc. So to be able to bring those other skill sets to the table, to be able to push the project forward, to be able to make the project more credible in the eyes of large organizations, people behind the curve, and those are all have a positive influence to the project. So I think, I think it's a really worthwhile endeavor because we all have to eat, right? Because what it means, like because open source software is valuable, it's worth doing more of. But people's time is also valuable. So in order to get their time, you got to figure a way to make it sustainable. So on that note, I think I kind of the end of, I think I ran out of time almost. So that's kind of the end of it for my talk. And then just one more public service announcement, both 4 p.m. And then t-shirts, yes, this is important. So we can, great,
Okay,
yeah.
great. Questions, folks? 1, 2. I will bring you a mic. It will be amazing.
So please come front at the end to pick up the awesome Jenkins X t-shirts. Oh, I should throw them, huh? Is that okay?
Totally fine.
All right.
Exercise caution, t-shirts in flight.
Well, the rest, I think, to be fair to the people in the back, I'll keep the rest in here.
All right, go ahead, please.
Am I amazing? Oh, yeah. I have a question regarding open source in a project which are focusing on products which are not for other developers like Jenkins, but for projects, let's say, for plumbers, for small business owners, for accountants, for farmers, where they actually, they're not involved in it. Would you somehow advise maybe new business models or something more specific for those kind of projects?
Well, yeah, so I guess the question is like, if my domain is not targeting the other developers, like what about it? So that's a great question because I think about that sometimes. My sense is, obviously I don't have any experience, but my sense is these projects do not get done as open source projects, right? Because you don't really get like other farmers to join, oh, like this is a great software. I'm going to improve this software by hacking the code. They don't do that. So I feel like they are better suited for the proprietary software and kind of avoid the problem.